Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this final class on James, led by Jeff Doane. Thank you so very much, Jeff, for your leadership and your thought in these matters. My name is Sam. I'm a member of the Adult Education Committee, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and to open with a few thoughts. I told Jeff that as I've been going through the book, I keep on reflecting back on some of the autobiographical writings of Frederick Douglass. And so I have just a few lines from Frederick Douglass's life and times. And I'd like to start with that and close with some prayerful thoughts from Howard Thurman. Frederick Douglass managed to learn how to read. He recognized that as being the key to breaking out of the bondage that was placed upon him. So after he learned how to read and grasped the importance of it, he was called to teach others to read. And so he led classes in reading the Bible, among other things. And he did view this as an act of liberation. So now reading from Frederick Douglass. Those dear souls who came to my Sabbath school came not because it was popular or reputable to do so, for they came with a liability of having 40 stripes laid on their naked backs. In this Christian country, men and women were obliged to hide in barns and woods and trees from professing Christians in order to learn to read the Holy Bible. Their minds had been cramped and starved by their cruel masters. The light of education had been completely excluded, and their hard earnings had been taken to educate their masters' children. I felt a delight in circumventing the tyrants and in blessing the victims of their curses. The year at Mr. Friedland's passed off very smoothly to outward seeming. Not a blow was given me during the whole year. To the credit of Mr. Friedland, irreligious though he was, it must be stated that he was the best master I ever had until I became my own master and assumed for myself, as I had a right to do, the responsibility of my own existence and the exercise of my own powers. And again, that was from Frederick Douglass. And now from Howard Thurman, if we could enter into a moment of prayer. God is with me in the sense that he is the creator and the sustainer of life. This is a part of my general thought and experience. God is with me. Always there is the persistent need for some deep inner assurance, some whisper in my heart, some stirring of the spirit within me that renews, recreates, and steadies, that whatever betides of light or shadow, I can look out on life with quiet eyes. God is with me. Amen.
Thank you so much, Sam, for setting up this morning. We do have a bit of a challenge, a little more than 200 pages in the next 55 minutes. And one of you has already commented to me that, we should have weeks and weeks to do this. Well, there are plenty of other outstanding weeks coming with other topics. So I just hope and pray you can keep reading the book and find the common wisdom we're sharing of help to you in that time. I also realized we needed to end a bit abruptly, so I'll decide that there was a turning point here. The struggle for us is from James' point of view, and I believe we touched on this briefly last week. The Bible becomes a tool of the enemy, the oppressor. And we struggle with that, but because the Bible can be read, though most of us do not, as baptizing slavery, it was that reminder from Meacham's book on Lincoln that our Southern sisters and brothers were not discriminating because of geography, but in most of the churches felt that unless you believed in slavery as a means of God, you were a heretic. And that's its own topic. And I'm trying to minimize the detours, and I'll quickly turn around on that one. But to think of that, and then to think of all of the events through Reconstruction and Jim Crow, it is just a painful reality. And to have that identified as the meaning of the Bible suggests that we have a great deal of evangelism to do, all of us, this church, all of those who are progressive believers and believe God is a God of liberation, as we were hearing from Frederick Douglass. It's also at this turn right about page 91. So we're going to go from there to the end today, or as close as we can get, where Jim now, he's not claiming James just yet, but Jim has somebody say, tell your story. And that's clearly the theme, and we end up with this book as the story that originates with Jim telling it. And all the difficulties. We talked about the symbolism of the pencil that travels with him, and the torture and then lynching of young George, who went to try and find him a tool with which to tell his story. And the description when Jim creeps through the trees and finds the gathering where young George is being beaten. And then young George somehow finds Jim's face. He says, he doesn't say it, but he mouths it, run, because it is just absolutely brutal. Again, the subversiveness of a slave being able to read, and then we were hearing of Frederick Douglass teaching himself, because that was just a subversive act. And then writing, even more subversive. So the framing of this whole book in light of that. I'm going to request again, if you would like to add a comment, and I encourage that, please. We'd like to have a fulsome discussion as best we can with limited time. Throw a hand in an air. This is new and old technology. Because if you all hit the button, we ended up with some cacophony last week, Fred discovered in the recording. So please just hit your button when you want to share something, throw your hand in the air, then hit your button when you're done. Okay? It will help our friends who are doing this online. And thank you. I understand, Polly, you're tracking that. So I will always look in your direction if we've got chat from online. We do soon run into these two scammers that we also encountered in Huck Finn. I was relieved. The scammers didn't get page after page after page that they did in Huck Finn. There's at least a little bit less here. But it's these two guys who are doing anything to make a buck. There is a timelessness to much of this as we look at who's doing what just to make money. And Jim says they were with us and we could not easily get rid of them. You know, it's who are these guys? But they are white. So there is some subtle protection But we find it becomes literally mortally dangerous to be with them later on. And some of this I was reading in light of the news this week. And on 126, folks be funny like that. They takes the lies they want and throws away the truths that scares them. Just, well, if you'd like to think of the news this week, I just thought I'd give you a sentence to ponder in terms of that, which is some of the amazing quality of this novel. I mean, Percival Everett chose to write this in the times in which we find ourselves for a very key reason. And so there are levels of meaning in each of these places. I'm seeing nodding heads, but I also want to see hands at points, and I'll just let you know where we are. So we're trying to move ahead. And it's always fine to look back. And as we get closer to the end, I'll be very fine if you're moving us further forward. And these two scammers they get referenced again on 133. The two fellows talk so much and say so little. That's often been a description of churches, so we have to hear that with some pain. A number of preachers get accused of that, but not here, of course.
Never.
A pattern through this book that it is just very powerful is it seems that Everett waits till the very concluding sentences of a chapter. And then there is a very profound, concise sentence or two, and then you move on. And it can either reflect the past or it's looking ahead in the transition. So if you find that you are not certain where you are in it, I suggest you look at the end of the chapter before. And that just lifts it up for you in very powerful way. Since I'm trying to move quicker, I did ask you to go back and look at the minstrel songs that are at the very beginning of the book. Some of you had. And you will see first the font is very different. It's longhand. And it is the notebook of Daniel Decatur Emmett. And he is the leader of the minstrel group, this very interesting interlude where somehow Jim gets heard singing and they decide to hire or buy Jim. And there's the purposeful ambiguity. And we'll look at this. So Jim suddenly becomes a member of the minstrel group. We had a bit of conversation about this last week. And while John is out of town, he said to me he remembers in the 1950s people doing blackface, the whole deal. And this is New Jersey outside of New York City. No, we're not just going to blame our southern neighbors, and doing minstrel songs. So we are not far from that. But the episode here of the minstrels is incredible. And it created almost the biggest threat to James' life. Did you remember? You're saying that, Annette. What?
I was thinking, in a way, what a pain it was to be a good tenor. Um, and
Because they're in short supply, right?
yeah, and that's why he was tapped. But I was also thinking that they, chained him and really messed up his ankles and lower legs. And then they get him into this group and he has to sing with all that pain for not knowing the songs, knowing the choruses and so on. And then he's almost discovered by this goofy guy who thinks that he's really black.
He is able to communicate. I don't think trying to pass, and we get this later in Norman, who he encounters in the minstrel group, who is actually pulling that off. Trying to pass, be in the minstrel group, who are all seeking in a very mocking way to do this to the whites. Does anybody remember the cakewalk being discussed here? That's the entrance of the minstrels. And what, again, we're moving sort of from irony and it's deepening into paradox because the slaves would mock the white folk with cakewalk. So the minstrels then learn cakewalk in their mocking way to the slaves. It is very rich, very complex, and the profundity of it is deeply, deeply painful. And yes, Bill, I'm sorry.
Jeff, is this going to work now, or did I?
Sure, just push it down toward.
Okay. Jeff, he depicts Emmett, the head of the minstrels, as both an abolitionist on the one hand, but really not quite at least in my reading, not a real true abolitionist. Is he trying to depict the person who actually wrote Dixie? Because there's a fellow named Emmett who wrote Dixie, the song. And is he trying to actually, is this a depiction of that author of Dixie?
I believe now, whether it actually is or not, Bill, I don't know, because he's protected. This is fiction, but he is portraying that. Yes, because these minstrel songs were written by Emmett and then Dixie becomes one of them. And it is so clear that I think they are not even anywhere near abolitionists. They just say, oh, we don't own slaves. Well, that's kind of like saying, well, I haven't done all that evil, so I'm just fine. I think Everett is pushing us hard to look at ourselves. Yeah, there is no safe place to stand when the matter is life and death, equality. It becomes for him an experience. I was struck by this very white-haired, bearded guy who keeps trying to get his hand into James' hair. I mean, just think about that for a minute. He even wakes him up. He somehow sneaks in, somebody you don't know. And because Emmett says, oh, it's the best wig we have, and his sort of half effort to explain to the man, but he becomes for James a real threat, that he knows that once he's out, he's dead. And it just led me to such painful realizations of people who have succeeded or tried and maybe been mortally injured for seeking to pass. And this takes us a little further ahead, but look at the interchange of James with Norman, who tragically James is not able to save in that one crucial time and after the boat goes down in the Mississippi. On 153, some of the best dialogue in this book is when James, of course, encounters other slaves. Because they are talking, and if they're in isolation, they talk in the wonderful English, not the slave talk, to which they have to quickly relapse as soon as a white person appears. And therefore, when James is dreaming and talking in his sleep, that's a real threat. Because when he's talking in his sleep, he's speaking splendid English, as they did with each other. But I love this sentence with Easter. If you're not making mistakes, says Easter, you're not learning. Profound realization with which we all live. And then it's followed by the painfully stereotypical question when some white folk run in to black folk, sing for me, as if that's the first thing. You owe that to me, you're to entertain me. Stunning. And it's singing and dancing, and that feeds our needs. Oh, good, entertain me, make me feel good. Maybe I feel guilty other times, but make me feel good. If I'm whipping by comments, please interrupt. We'll keep whipping along. So, and if you see a hand and I'm missing it, let me know. There are so many painful passages here. I don't know how you even rate them, but on 158, Jim and Easter, two slaves, listen while Emmett negotiates Jim's sale. And there's a deeply interesting contrast. Is this a bill of sale, or is this the price of hiring a prize tenor? And we are left in the midst of that ambiguity, which is, I think, where we need to be left. But he writes, they were negotiating the sale of Jim as if he was a horse, a thing that could sing. Thing. People have said to me, this novel is so painful. I said, it better be. And we have to face that pain to begin to grasp this. What else? Do you remember when the minstrels are singing and Jim, who's sharp, is quickly picking this up, and I'm sure his strong tenor voice is helping carry the day for the minstrels. Do you remember when he starts to look eye to eye with people in the audience? You're nodding, Allison. I'll put you on the spot of just about that scene.
I mean, the counter sort of, they're thinking white under the black. He's coming from his own perspective, painting them his own way.
And I think he finds it scary because if this is what he's seeing, and he's so on the cusp of being discovered, when they had to get white around his eyes, but then black on top of black, Everett just is amazing in his description of the details of this situation. And then when he gets talking with Norman, of course, they're around all these white minstrels, but Norman says, and you can drop the slave talk. And this is where they begin to reflect on the cakewalk, which had been sort of, when slaves were certain they were on their own, a way of mocking the white owners. And here, that's the way the minstrels enter town, apparently. That was the sort of the opening act. You stir up your audience by cakewalking into town. It's another of the many levels that we get here. Yes, Jim, sorry.
I think this whole passage and this part of James' life is the most fraught because of the idea of a single drop of black blood makes you black, and there's a lot of role playing across everybody's position. In that, Jim is there. There's the man who passes for white, and when you think of, sometimes when you see slave owner and slave interactions, you think it's black and white, but there are mixed blood across all the people involved in a lot of these scenes, and you think of the structures they set up for the cruelty that go across. They have to make it single blood or a single drop because otherwise it's completely untenable. Because there aren't pure black, pure white in the South at the time. I don't know if did you know about Bert? Does anyone know about Bert Williams? He was the funniest man on vaudeville in 1910 to like 1930, and he was a black man who had to perform in blackface on the East Coast. But W.C. Fields said he was the funniest man he'd ever seen on stage. But even then, in the jazz age in New York, he had to wear blackface because they wouldn't let a black man share a stage with white performers.
Right. And thank you for underlining that, because it isn't simply they were fearful of being revealed. It was literally, if there was any sense, the separation was that deep. 184, I'm going to keep pushing us a bit. It is interesting how we get focused in some of these anecdotal situations, and then James is on the run again. And it's now, is he running from Emmett? He does run from the minstrels because of the incredible threatening experiences. And is he running from the idea of remaining a slave? Because he confronts them and says, now, am I going to get paid like everybody else? Emmett says, well, I've paid you in advance. And how much do I get paid per performance? Do you remember? $1 a performance. So he owed Emmett 200 performances, if there's an illusion or maybe even reality of being a free man. So he has also lost Huck at this point. When he's lost and when he reconnects with Huck. And we have discussed here, so this doesn't need a spoiler alert, later on when he informs Huck that Huck is his son, and wrestle with all that because, of course, another man who beat Huck raised Huck. So the levels here again. And it's interesting that the running is just stunning because you realize it's not that you pack a few meals carefully, pack your suitcase. Usually when you're running, you're doing it instantly. Although sometimes he just yells, grab food or something. But, and running is, you run and you usually are trying to run at night. If you can find a safe place during the day, then maybe you can sleep. And then food. I've never been a fisherman, but I was intrigued at all these catfish trot lines, and maybe some of you could inform me on that. But they managed to poach a few catfish and get away with it. So even if they can't set up their own trot lines, because that was just on the island, that sort of land which was a preserve for them. It's phrases that keep striking me when a woman thinks that they are white and says, referring to the slaves, they're like little monkeys, ain't they? And we've read about this and heard about this, but the only way to maintain a sense of property is to keep people always as the other. And for me, that's just the refrain again in the midst of the news. How are we defining the other? How does that keep us comfortably distant from engaging? It's scary. And there's also some truth. This isn't, just lambasting the white folk. On 195, whites had no monopoly on duplicity, dishonesty, or perfidy. So he is realizing and naming what he can name, but none of us who are white could ever name. Oh, there were some slaves who decided they'd make the best of their circumstances to their recognition. And therefore, if they had to, tell off another slave and risk their lives, they'd do it if it enhanced their own well-being. But for me, this is part of the complexity rich complexity of this novel. That's human beings. And so it again throws another level. Of course, it's human beings, and we are all struggling with ways of seeking to get along. I want to see if you recall it. I'm looking ahead to 211. Sammy, the slave girl, in your reading. Do you remember their encounter with her? Somebody want to identify her or that setting? It was an awful slave setting. It's the pit in which they're digging. He assumes she is a young boy. She is not. They're just stopping and they're running again. And James says, come with us. But you're running and it's a risk. Yes. Sam just said, and the result is while they're trying to float in the water and the white folk come on the scene with guns, she is shot and killed, and they have to bring her to shore. And Everett just writes this powerful scene in which James thinks, well, she was dead in slavery. She had some moments of freedom, and now she's dead. But for any of us to begin to ponder that situation, again, Catherine, you were reminding me that this is hugely emotional, and that can slow down our reading as we're wrestling with our own emotions. Yes.
Oh, I was just gonna say.
Sorry, Melissa.
Yeah, I was
Yeah,
just gonna
if
say,
you-
the quote you just talked about was on page 225 for people who wanted to follow along. We should have left her where she was, Norman said. At least she'd be a live slave, not just another dead runaway. I studied the lifeless body on the ground before me. She was dead when I found her, I said. She's just now died again, but this time she died free. That's a great.
the powerful sense of language and words which characterizes this whole novel. It's about this point in the novel where it feels like if you could measure a novel with a sense of an accelerator, Everett steps on the gas is my, it's not anywhere near as good as his images, but the pace just takes off. So my appeal is if you're not finished with it, stay with it. Just make sure your seatbelt is buckled as you get into this last bit, because it just really moves fast. They have gone and been able to climb aboard, if you recall, the steamship. And this was a way of staying alive. But something's wrong with the steamship. And he encounters the slave who spends his entire life shoveling coal into the boiler. Anyway, it's one of those incredibly graphic scenes because the broiler, they keep shoveling coal. They put a little bit of cornbread outside the door. And James is watching this. He has to send, this is before he loses Huck again. Huck is white, so he can go up on other decks. And this is when they begin to realize things. There are Union soldiers. Emmett is one of the people we discover later who's also on this boat. So it becomes sort of a drawing together of the characters. And then comes the dramatic scene, and his skill in narrating is superb, Everett's, because you've got this exploding, all these people in the water, and then it becomes a very existential moment as he writes this. James realizes he's hearing two voices, and they're about equidistant from him. And it's who to try and save. Huck's voice, Norman's voice, the slave slash friend who was passing. And he's able to save Huck, but not Norman. Any other memories of the beach scene where any who survived were on the beach? It startled me because if they'd survived, they were grateful to be alive. The threats of separation, they were all equally on the beach. They had all equally, by the grace of God, survived. Others hadn't. And so the threat of Emmett, who recognizes him, but everybody is so barely alive that he can't pursue his prized tenor. it's an equalizing scene for me that's very, very startling. Um, and he reflects again on the Mississippi, this huge river that is both the scene, as we reflected back to Huck Finn, of peace, one with nature, lying on the raft or in the skiff or in the canoe, viewing the stars. And then here's this intrusion of steamboat, which is civilization. And a little reminder that Huck Finn was a steamboat captain. So we get layers that Percival looks back with appreciation to Finn, but also some great apprehension. Pardon me, Twain. Yes, excuse me. To Twain's writing in Finn. I appreciate the correction, Judy. Thank you. I was startled, I guess, by that interesting fishing scene. They're desperate. And they go fishing with their hands into the water. And the fish grabs his hand and takes him to the bottom, this being James, and he has to struggle to get to the surface and get his arm removed. I thought if there was, if anybody was sort of saying, oh, where are we going here? Where's the action? Everett decided to provide a very interesting, if strange, sense of action here with that. $265. See, we're gonna get there. I'm sure we've skipped over a lot, but I was stunned with the reflection because James in the running at another place he reminds us the danger of letting slaves be in their own minds because they're going to think. He has these great dream sequences where John Locke comes up out of the water and they engage in philosophical debate. And this is where he gets in trouble too, because he's conversing in excellent English with Locke. But he concludes on 265, white people so often have no need to survive, but only to live. This novel is a novel of his struggle to survive. And then he watches the white folk who are just living day to day. Of course, much easier because the slaves do all the work. But it again introduced the layers of his thought. And a reminder that Everett has placed his novel in the late 1850s, very early 1860s. We've got blue uniforms from the north coming south. So they're soldiers. And he frames it very early. Fort Sumter has just happened, at least in the novel. And states are beginning to secede. But it is such an artistic framing because you've got James and Huck struggling to find their way, always keeping the Mississippi close to them, and the soldiers coming southbound as they're moving northbound. So very unlike Huck Finn by Twain, where it was positioned before the Civil War, even though it was 1885. So ways of carving up the distinctions between Everett and Twain. One of the scenes that once I'd read it, I thought, yes, this is clearly one of the most horrible scenes in the book, but we need to read it. He gets back finally to home to discover that his wife and daughter are not there. And he is exhausted. He hasn't had anything to eat. So he convinces the slaves that are there to hide him in the corner. And then in comes the overseer, who is conveniently arranged for the husband to be elsewhere. So he can do as he always does and rape his wife. And his skill in writing is part of what makes just the images of that scene so horrific as it is by definition. Horrible, violent act. And it changes some of the last scenes of the book because he knows that he's a dead man if he tried to intervene. But we're left with the ambiguity because that allows the development further in the book. I think, Catherine, you're right. That's one of the ones where you can't read through it. Okay, what's next? No, it's horribly going to stop us.
I had a really hard time doing this book in 3 weeks. I mean, I really felt I needed breaks in order to absorb the horror of what I was reading. It was extraordinarily painful, and John has referred to me a couple times, so I just thought I should make a comment. It was
Yeah.
very painful, and at least couldn't we have had a month, John?
Well, the risk of doing, profound literature is 3 weeks is better than no weeks. Sorry. For you, that can sound like cheap grace. I mentioned to a few people, I will be teaching this summer in a very different setting where I have 18 hours to do James. That's class time. So we'll be able to plumb some of the depths. I'm just hoping some of this gets you to stay with it and keep going. I've taught this place for over 30 years, so I usually like to teach it in Chicago or teach there first and then come back. But we're going to have to find the accelerator again. My foot slipped. It's interesting, after this rape, he knows that he's going to be discovered. Where does he go? Do you remember the safe haven for James and Huck when they're together? The island, thank you. And if it's not the Mississippi where they can let their guard down, it's the island. And he is hoping that they will be able to survive on the island this time too. And then he swims there. There's no time to wait to find a boat or build a raft. And then he realizes he may have lost his most important possession. Yes? Well, it's also the pencil. And fortunately, he found the notebook of the minstrel songs in which he's been writing his story on the beach after the explosion of the steamship. But he pats his pocket and somehow the pencil has stayed with him, which is a powerful way of saying the story goes on. Then this book is interesting. It goes very hard in the plot, and then there's a pause. And we get this most amazing philosophical reflection about time. Because he's indicated earlier, slaves have a lot of time. It isn't that they don't work themselves to the bone, but time he defines then as dead spaces separated by dead spaces. And they aren't just spaces, they are dead spaces. They're spaces where you're in pain, you're not free. And so it's a combination of incredible action with some of the most horrific scenes, and then the philosophical reflection. At page 281, see, we've got a chance here, folks. James says, I found my anger and stoked it. In other words, he didn't just let it sit there. And what this then leads to is the drunken overseer Hopkins, who with his buddies had come to the island, and he apparently, Hopkins, got so drunk they left him to go fishing. Well, James is on the island too. And another of the most intense, violent scenes is when James is able to creep up behind Hopkins. Do you remember, those of you who are this far along, what happens then? He strangles Hopkins to death. Here was the overseer, the rapist, the violent man, because the overseers were entrusted with the whipping. And it's another of those scenes that you don't just read and say, oh yes, what's next? Because the incredible use of his language, it feels like we're peeking out from the trees and seeing this happen. What he does manage to learn, and he's fighting James here, excuse me, to keep walking north. Do you recall he takes a little detour back to the judge's house? Which is a scene of deep poetic justice at all kinds of levels. Because here's the source of the books that helped him learn to read and then inspired his writing. But he had snuck in the study, and he now has a gun. He has the overseer's gun. As he says later, he has become the angel of violence. Live with that paradox. Angel, violence, but so he kidnaps the judge. And he is able to, with the threat of violence, find from the judge where his family is. He's been searching, he's been staying alive. And his wife and daughter have been sold to a breeding farm. Now, we should be aware that they existed, but most of us probably weren't. How do you maintain your labor base? Breeding farms. And somehow they were deemed to be the breeders. And the description with the judge, he ties the judge up. The judge, of course, is horrified. How could this happen? And convinced that James is going to be found out. And but he has a sense of where this breeding farm is, and so he learns what he needs to learn, and is able then to finally find himself there. At this point, there was a real interesting interaction, which we haven't talked about, where he convinces Huck to stay with the widow Douglas, with the judge, well, before he kidnaps the judge, because then Huck will be okay. Huck fluctuates between, I ain't no N-word, and he says to Huck, no, I'm a slave. I'm not what you're saying. But he knows that Huck needs to have a life of his own. And Huck obviously can't pass. So it's not going to be with him. So it then gets focused on the final goal of reunion with his family. And James is able to find himself there. He knows that he either is going to die or find them. And we're not really given a lot of cues to this final concluding scene. And in fact, this is like being on the freeway where you decide to defy the speed limit, if I can belabor my lame metaphor, because suddenly we are flying to the finish without really any clues of how it's going to happen. And for the first time, we begin to hear this insistence. People are asking about him. His reputation is fearsome. It's out there, this threatening runaway slave. And he now says, I'm not Jim. What's your last name? I am James. He has written himself into being. And that's what really gets named remarkably here. He's also not quite sure just where he is. That's also the theme of this. Uncertainty. He gets some hints that he's in Iowa. Well, free state. That's a very important thing. And that amazing scene of reunion where they're finally together again, his family, the whole purpose of this running. And yet it's in a very fraught situation. He's set this plantation on fire, fortunately finds the men who are part of the breeding farm. They work with him and direct him to the women's quarters. And in that amazing scene, he is running with his 9-year-old daughter who's yelling, Papa, 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 having never expected to see him again. And the fact that this resolution happens, you wait, okay, what's going to happen next? It's already happened. They are reunited. And so all the layers of the novel come together. It's noon. I thought we might, and I know some of you need to leave. I want to make sure if there are any questions or comments on this rich, rich narrative. Yes, Melissa.
I just wanted to, one of my favorite things was the very last thing written, the last line of his acknowledgement at the very end. Finally, a nod to Mark Twain. His humor and humanity affected me long before I became a writer. Heaven for the climate, hell for my long-awaited lunch with Mark Twain. And
That's the last word in the acknowledgements.
Yeah.
You always want to look at those things. There's some hidden treasures.
it brought to mind there. I'm a person that likes hard copy, and I tear things out and put them in things. And I visited Mark Twain's house in Hartford when my daughter was looking at East Coast colleges, and I spent a whole day there and just loved it. And that's where I discovered his book, The War Prayer, which is one of the things that he didn't allow to be published until after he died. And I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. In fact, I even have a one-page photocopy that I'd made for my son's kindergarten teacher years ago that I have some extra copies of. And there's also a December 22nd, 2008 New Yorker article by Mark Twain called The Privilege of the Grave. And it's very timely. I recommend it as well.
Thank you.
Enough for me.
Any other comments? I'm, as I've said before, moving slowly, so I'm happy to talk with you a bit. I just encourage you to come toward this end of the room to do it. It's a powerful book, but thank you all for the time we've been able to spend on it.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Jeff, thanks again. And just as a reminder,
Oh, yes, please.
on Sunday, Matt Helms will lead a 3-week session on comparing the Gospels. So we look forward to more amazing thought, discussion, and leadership. Have a great week, everyone. And thank you again, Jeff.
Most welcome, Sam. Thank you.